Dear friends and colleagues, I hope you had a good lunch. Thank you for staying with us. The topic and the theme of the first panel this afternoon is the North Korean Human Rights Act. And we're going to discuss both the US North Korean Human Rights Act and the South Korean Human Rights Act. Of course, South Korea sees significant pendulum shifts from one administration to the next. If the ruling party changes, if the president of the other party wins. Here we have been quite fortunate that we disagree on a lot of issues in Washington, but this continues to be a bipartisan or nonpartisan issue. We all agree that the human rights situation in North Korea is terrible. We all agree that measures have to be taken. Now the question is, of course, what kind of measures and what implementation is needed. My organization, the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, and both Ambassador King and Dr. Eberstadt are members of the board of directors. We present ourselves as a bipartisan or nonpartisan organization, but I even think we're beyond that. Our politics is the human rights of the people of North Korea. Our US politics is never an issue, quite frankly. So anyway, I have the privilege of introducing our three speakers. Ambassador Robert King was a special envoy for North Korean human rights in the State Department. He's also a member of the board of directors of HRNK. Dr. Nick Eberstadt is Henry Wen Chair at the American Enterprise Institute and also a board member of the U.S. Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, HRNK. And Ethan Hee-Seok Shin is a key senior member of the Transitional Justice Group in South Korea, and also a scholar at Yonsei University. Thank you all for joining us today. Ambassador King, I'm going to ask you to get us started. Perhaps you could comment on the importance of the North Korean Human Rights Act here in the United States and how the act helped you in your work.
Got to turn on my mic, and I'm not.
And if it turns green,
I think you can probably hear me better now. It's very clear that the North Korean Human Rights Act was central to what I was doing. I wouldn't have been there if it hadn't been for the North Korea Human Rights Act. The legislation, the way it was originally written, called for the designation of a special envoy for North Korea human rights issues. It was renewed, reauthorized 4 years later. It was initially came into effect in 2004 and 2008 when we reauthorized the legislation. The provision called for the appointment not only of a special envoy, but a full-time special envoy, and he was to have, or she was to have the rank of ambassador. So there was a real interest and concern, at least on the part of the Congress, in terms of having the envoy involved with the North Korea human rights issues. One of the things the most important thing I think of with the legislation is not that it gave certain authorities that the State Department, the United States government could not carry out if it chose to do so, but it made a very strong statement and commitment on the part of the United States that this was an important issue, that human rights in North Korea was an issue that was of concern to the United States Congress, and it was an important concern for the United States Congress. The act has been reauthorized about every 4 or 5 years since it was initially authorized, although currently we do not have an extension of the North Korea Human Rights Act. Congress specifies that when you pass legislation nowadays, you have to pass it for only a specific period of time, 4 or 5 years. And then if the legislation is still valid, important, and necessary, you extend it, you reauthorize the legislation. There's an article in the Washington Post this morning about something to do with abortion. And there is the possibility that an abortion case is going to come up involving an 1876 law that was passed. And this was the idea behind Congress saying, you know, pass a law, it's only good for 5 years unless you specifically extend it. We've done that with the North Korea Human Rights Act, and every 4 or 5 years we have extended the law. It says we're concerned about this issue and we're going to continue to deal with it. So I think that the important thing there is that this is a commitment that clearly reflects the broad American population. Unlike most other issues, North Korea Human Rights Act is one that has broad bipartisan support. There has never been a controversial vote to reauthorize the legislation. In most cases, it's passed by voice vote. All those in favor say aye, those opposed no. The ayes have it and nobody cares. You know, that's the end of it. When there have been a couple of occasions when it's had to have votes, it's been unanimous. And one can say if Congress is unanimous on anything, it must be really good. One of the problems with the North Korea Human Rights Act right now is that our politics have become so dysfunctional that even something as non-controversial and as unanimous in terms of its support didn't make it through the last Congress. So we are without a North Korea Human Rights Act in force right now. Doesn't mean that we have backed off on any of our commitments, but I think it says something about our politics. Anything else? Oh, the other thing that is, I think, of concern, the legislation called for the creation, the establishment of the Office of a Special Envoy for North Korea Human Rights Issues. Unfortunately, I am the last person to hold that position. It has now been 6 years since we have had a special envoy. And this, I think, is a sad comment in terms of what's going on. It is a reflection of the Trump administration choosing not to make that appointment. The first Secretary of State in the Trump administration proposed eliminating the position specifically and getting rid of it. The second Secretary of State simply did not arrange for anyone to be appointed to the position and left it at that. I'm disappointed that the Biden administration took 2 years before they got around to appointing a special envoy, but they did it, and that is encouraging. As I assume most of you know, Julie Turner, who has been nominated as the special envoy for North Korea human rights issues, had a confirmation hearing yesterday. She and 4 other ambassadorial nominees had about an hour-long presentation. She gave an excellent description of the concerns that she as special envoy will be focused on. It was a non-controversial discussion, and so my assumption is we will have a special envoy probably in a couple of weeks. It'll take, excuse me, it takes a couple of, several days once the hearing is over to get all the paperwork done, to take a nomination to the floor of the Senate for a vote. And the Senate will be euphemistically on state visits next week. So they will not be in session here, but they will be in session the week after Labor Day. And my guess is that's about the time you can expect on Thursday night or Friday night late. 5 nominations for ambassador will come up, and one of those will be Julie Turner. So I'm encouraged that we're at least moving in the right direction in terms of moving forward on this. That's way too long a response to your question, Greg, but.
No, that was terrific. Thank you. Nick, what would your thoughts be on what has appeared to be a lack of momentum? We have the North Korean Human Rights Act, and we have lost the initiative. We have lost the momentum.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I'm with HRNK and Ned and Hoover. Thank you for inviting me. Let's look at it from the other side of the telescope. what seems to make North Korean officials more frantic and more hysterical than their ordinary mode of frantic and hysterical in interacting with the international community. One episode that made North Korean officialdom apoplectic was the Banco Delta Asia affair, when the U.S. Saw to it that North Korean international funds were frozen. The level of emotion and apoplexy on the part of North Korean officials was, even for North Korean rhetoric, extraordinary, because that was a pressure point, and they realized that this was a vital pressure point for the regime. Another aspect of international relations where North Korean officials go froth is in discussions about human rights. Won't talk with interlocutors if human rights are going to come up, will walk out if this is going to be on the table. Why? It's not because of their ordinary bad manners. It's because they perceive this to be an extraordinary threat to the viability of the regime, and they react with all of the forcefulness that you would expect if you were defending a vital national interest. So go back to your question, Greg. So what does it mean when we have this sort of awful syzygy or alignment of the planets, where for years and years, both the ROK and the US did not have envoys on human rights in North Korea? It's kind of a very welcome signal to the Kim family regime that a vulnerability in their police state system is not going to be confronted by the most effective coalition of allies in the free world. I'm sure we've all heard here, if we've been involved in human rights at all, the admonition and the warning that you must not instrumentalize human rights for reasons of state. But the absent without leave, or the absent with leave situation, where we had no envoys in Seoul and in Washington for year after year after year, was actually an instrumentalization of human rights. Because in Seoul, the left-oriented government has its own sort of psychopathology about North Korean human rights and doesn't want to go there ever. And in the US, there was a particular sort of interpretation of realpolitik, which wasn't, I think, terribly based in reality, which thought that by sidelining human rights, we were going to get to yes with the North Korean government. It never works that way. It never has worked that way. It never will work that way. But that was, I think, the calculation. Now it looks as if we're going to get the gears into place. We've got the envoy from Seoul, and we hope we have an envoy from the US soon. But it's been an awfully long absence. It's been an awfully long lacuna. And it's not a lacuna that has worked to the advantage of the human rights situation in North Korea. Frankly, it's not been a situation that's worked to the advantage of the international community or the Western alliance. There's only one party that's benefited from this, and it's a very little state far away that's running a really good dictatorship.
Thank you, Nick. We have addressed the American, the US North Korean Human Rights Act. But of course, we remember that for many years, we're waiting for the ratification of the South Korean Human Rights Act, and we're hoping for implementation. The theme of today's talk is problems and prospects. Ethan, could you please share your thoughts? Well, your thoughts on the current status of the South Korean Human Rights Act, the implementation status. Perhaps you can share a little about the history of the South Korean Human Rights Act and what it could mean in a better world.
Certainly. Thank you, Greg. So in South Korea, we have our own version of the North Korean Human Rights Act that was enacted in 2016. And you can notice immediately that this came after 12 years after the US first passed its North Korean Human Rights Act, and also 10 years after Japan enacted its version of North Korean Human Rights Act in 2006. So it's fair to say that the bill was much more controversial politically in South Korea than it was in other countries like America and Japan. And I will probably not dwell into the whole complex situation, but basically because of our history going back to the partition in 1945 and the war between 1950 and 1953, North Korea is a single, I guess, the most important, I guess, political divide that exists within South Korean society. Has been like that for decades, and very simply, the conservatives tend to be more vocal about North Korea's weapons program and also its human rights violations, whereas the progressives, the more leftist people, tend to be to emphasize peace, reconciliation with North Korea, even at the cost of not discussing or basically shoving human rights issues aside. Which that was basically why it took so long for the South Korean National Assembly to enact this law only in 2016. Another complicating factor that is not so widely discussed was of some very different nature, was much more of a intra-bureaucratic issues within South Korea. So basically, we have some of the key ministries I'm talking about are the Ministry of Unification, which is supposed to be like the ministry that oversees inter-Korean relationship, and then the Ministry of Justice, pretty self-explanatory, and then the National Human Rights Commission of Korea. And the initial focus of the North Korean Human Rights Act in Korea in the mid-2000s was this kind of bureaucratic turf battle between these three different bureaucracies over who will have access to the interviews with the Hanawan defectors. Because, as you know, it's a very unique system that we have where basically most of the defectors who come to South Korea are first processed by our intelligence services, and then they're sent to this kind of resettlement education program for 2-3 months at a place called Hanawan. And that is where you can actually very easily interview North Korean defectors in South Korea and acquire information about the human rights situation in North Korea. And so to make the story very simple, the Ministry of Unification won this, I guess, the political or bureaucratic turf battle. So the actual North Korean Human Rights Act that was passed in 2016 provides that the MOU, Ministry of Unification's North Korean Human Rights Records Center will have the initial shot at interviewing the defectors at Hanawan. And then whatever materials that are produced from these interviews will be sent to the Ministry of Justice's North Korean Human Rights Archive, where the MOJ archive would actually prepare case files, the perpetrator cards, victim cards, that would be actually used for criminal prosecutions. So obviously, so basically the MOJ has no access, even if it wants to have like these additional interviews with the defectors who provided this kind of information. They have no legal grounds to do so. So that was a very problematic arrangement. One, because the MOU, like I said, has the primary role of negotiating with the North Korean officials. So it was a little odd, to say the least, that they are basically giving this brief to basically record all the the human rights violations committed by their North Korean counterparts. Secondly, the MOU does not have legal lawyers or prosecutors. They are mostly career bureaucrats that are not necessarily who have had legal training, whereas the MOJ are mostly peopled by the career prosecutors. So just like from the common sense point of view, it would have made more sense for the MOJ to take over this role, but that's not how it worked out. And basically, that the human rights recording role has gone to the MOU. So that's one of the two important pillars of the North Korean Human Rights Act in South Korea. The other one being the creation of a North Korean Human Rights Foundation with the express purpose of providing funding for North Korean human rights and humanitarian NGOs. Now that part of the bill, the law, has also hit a snag because the half of the board of directors for the Human Rights Foundation is supposed to be appointed by the ruling party, and the other half by the opposition party. And unfortunately, the Democratic Party that's now in opposition have since 2016 maintained this position that they will refuse to appoint their allotted number of directors. And this has effectively prevented the foundation from being created. So that part was never really implemented after 2016. And what happened with the North Korean human rights documentation work was that 1 year after the enactment of this, the North Korean Human Rights Act, we had a change of government in a very dramatic manner after the president at the time, Park Geun-hye, was impeached. And she was replaced by Moon Jae-in from the progressive side. And basically, the new president didn't have much interest in doing this kind of documentation work. So both the MOU's Human Rights Record Center and also the MOJ's Human Rights Archive have kind of languished in this kind of state for 5 years. And even after the change of government, it hasn't been too easy to kind of make up for this lost 5 years. And we are still trying to have both these MOU and MOJ bodies set up and running to do what they're supposed to do, which is to record the human rights violations in North Korea, so that basically as a deterrent for the North Korean regime from continuing to commit these violations. But that's roughly speaking where things stand for now with respect to the North Korean Human Rights Act in South Korea.
Thank you, Ethan. If the foundation were to become operational, would that be a game changer for NGOs such as yours?
It definitely has the potentials, I think. The problem is that, which is basically why the very reason why the current opposition party is dead set against it. And we will be having our National Assembly elections next April. So if the current ruling party wins the National Assembly elections, it might I guess push the DP to reconsider many of his political positions. But again, that's still I think it's still too early to say how the DP will revise or not revise its position on this matter.
Thank you very much. From this point on, I'm going to invite the members of the audience to ask questions anytime. Please just raise your hand. If possible, state your name and affiliation. And also, if possible, please specify to whom you're addressing the question, or whether you're addressing the question to all panelists. In the meantime, Ambassador King, There are some former North Korean friends and colleagues in the audience. Many of us, or all of us, are dedicated to North Korean human rights issues, but not many of us have been to North Korea. Could you share your memories of that visit?
I had the opportunity of visiting North Korea on 2 occasions. The first was about 2005. I was working on the Hill. Congressman Tom Lantos was the senior Democrat on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I was his chief of staff and the staff director for him. We were hopeful that conditions were moving in a direction that might be positive, and the North Koreans were also willing to invite Americans to come and visit. This was shortly after the United States had spent considerable sums on humanitarian assistance for North Korea, and the North Koreans saw some benefit to it. We spent a couple of days in North Korea with Congressman Lantos and had some interesting conversations with North Koreans. Not a lot came out of it, but it was interesting to have been there. You get a very different feeling for North Korea when you see it firsthand. The second opportunity I had to visit North Korea was in 2011. I was special envoy. At the time, we were considering the possibility of providing humanitarian assistance to North Korea. The North Koreans had made a request for aid. We indicated that we'd be willing to consider the possibility of providing some humanitarian aid, but we would have to talk with the North Koreans and agree on terms that under our laws would have to be met before we could provide the aid. I was the person who was designated to negotiate with the North Koreans to see what we could do in terms of meeting the requirements. In providing aid, one of the things the United States is quite insistent on is that we have to be able to monitor the distribution of aid to make sure that aid that is provided goes to those for whom it is intended. And that was one of the things that is written in law. If we were to provide aid without being able to monitor the assistance, we would have a real problem from Congress. So we went to North Korea in about this time of year. It was in May of 2011. We had a flight on North Korean Airlines from Beijing to Pyongyang that is a flight I will never forget. The plane almost went down. As we were flying along at a reasonably level elevation, the plane suddenly went into a dive. And I mean, it was a dive. The stewardesses screamed. These are the calm people that are supposed to reassure you. And when you see stewardesses screaming, there was panic. I gripped the side and looked out the window and watched as we continued to descend. The pilots were finally able to get the plane under control. Obviously, they didn't have it under control. They brought the plane back around, and then we went up at about the same level that we had gone down. There was some reassurance that we were at least going up. But finally, as stewardesses again expressed concern about what was going on, the pilot was able to level the plane off. By this point, we were getting relatively close to Pyongyang, and in a cheerful voice, the stewardess announced that we were going to land, and everybody should fasten their seatbelts as if nothing had happened. We landed. The runway at the Pyongyang airport is a military runway. It is built to handle large military aircraft. And the length of the runway is close to 2 miles, almost twice the length of an average runway. We hit the ground reasonably okay, but then you usually have the pilot either turning the engines on and reversing, or they drop the flaps or something like this. Pilot did nothing. We were just going right down the runway. Eventually, friction brought us to the point where the plane was again under control, but we were at the end of the runway before that happened. We got off the plane and were greeted by the North Koreans, and as if nothing had happened. I'm happy to say that we were able to make it out without that kind of problem. This is a Russian aircraft. It was the newest Russian aircraft. When we left North Korea a week later, we left on an old Russian aircraft, and it was far rougher, but far safer than the other one that we'd been on. That was an interesting aside, but the purpose of the trip was to see if we could reach agreement with the North Koreans on negotiating terms that would allow us to meet our legal requirements to be able to monitor the aid. We had some lengthy discussions in Pyongyang about what we would need to do. We were very transparent from the very beginning. We would like to provide aid. If we do, we have to meet these requirements. North Koreans didn't create any problems or difficulties. We had good conversations. When we left, I had asked to see an American who was being detained there, a fellow by the name of Eddie Jun, who had been living in China, had been providing parts for tractors and equipment in North Korea, and was arrested when he was there. We requested that we see him. We were able to see him in the hospital where he was being taken care of. We were able to have conversations with him, and when we left, the North Koreans gave him to me as a going away present. And we were able to take him back to back to Pyongyang, and then he went from there back to Seoul, where his family was at the time. But the North Koreans obviously were interested in trying to do something. I was encouraged by the fact that they did allow Eddie Jun to be released and to come out with us. We still had issues to deal with on getting North Korea to agree to the conditions that we had to meet to provide aid. We agreed that we would negotiate again. We ended up having 2 or 3 more rounds of negotiations. We agreed to have them in Beijing. It was easier for us to communicate with Washington from Beijing, and the North Koreans probably appreciated an excuse to get away for a little while. In any case, we were able to meet. We held negotiations initially in the North Korean embassy and then in the US embassy in Beijing. The negotiations, we were fairly rigid because we were limited in terms of what we could do. Congress says aid has to be observed and monitored to make sure that it is meeting the conditions under which assistance is provided. We reached an agreement that we thought would solve that problem. The North Koreans, we had some ups and downs with the North Koreans that we were negotiating with, but we agreed to the terms. I returned from the trip to the next to the last trip to Pyongyang in December of 2011. It was Christmas. My wife and I had some friends over. I had gotten back that day, and we had people over that evening. And as we were finishing dinner and cleaning up the dishes, I turned on the television, and found that Kim Jong-il had died. And suddenly everything that we had negotiated had come to a halt. We attempted to contact the North Koreans for a month after the death of Kim Jong-il, and we were not able to get anything from them. Shortly after about a month or so, when Kim Jong-un had taken over, the North Koreans contacted us and said they would like to negotiate and finish the negotiations so we could complete the work. We had a final round of negotiations in Beijing. Everything seemed to be positive. We had what we needed to sell to the US government. We thought they had what was required to sell to Kim Jong-un. I was on my way. I was actually in Rome to talk to the Food and Agriculture Organization. FAO was going to assist in terms of some of the aspects of it, and we had meetings to talk about what needed to be done. We had reached agreement with FAO, and I got a phone call from Washington saying the North Koreans have announced that they are going to test another nuclear weapon, and under these circumstances, Congress would execute us if we went ahead with providing aid. So that was the end of our efforts to provide assistance. We did provide small amounts, and I mean very small amounts, a few $100,000 of assistance after floods in 2016, I think it was. But we were never able to go very far in terms of being able to get into serious negotiations for real humanitarian assistance. And the North Koreans were not willing to meet the conditions that unfortunately we had to satisfy. Way too long an answer again, but
No, that was a fascinating answer. Thank you very much for sharing. One very quick question, Bob. Did you get any indication of which Kim regime agency had custody of Eddie Yoon at the time, was in charge of the hostages?
It was not clear. Eddie Yoon was in the guest hospital, the really good hospital in Pyongyang. When we arrived there, there were 4 burly guards who were guarding this poor man who was in a hospital bed. But there was no indication as to who actually had custody of him.
Thank you very much. Not surprising.
Yeah.
Nick, you've had quite a few interactions with North Koreans. Could you share your memories of those interactions?
A lifetime of memory.
Yes.
A lifetime of memories, yes, in so few minutes. Well, I suppose my favorite stroll down memory lane would have to do with my homework on demographics. I visited DPRK back in the good old days in 1990, before 2 of the Kims had passed away, before the famine, before the collapse of the economy, before the detonation of any of the atomic devices. So it's really kind of the old days. And I wanted to get permission to use some demographic materials which had been passed along to the United Nations. Actually, without permission, with a colleague at the Census Bureau, we'd taken these things apart and put them back together and had more or less reconstructed the population trends of North Korea as best we could from the ceasefire until the late 1980s, which is the period of data that we had there. But I needed to get permission, so somehow or other I met with North Korean statistical officials, and they said, sure, you can publish this stuff. They probably let me do that because they didn't have any trained people in population studies at that time. That's why they actually, I think, gave the population information that they did to the United Nations, because they didn't know how to improve it and make it even better than it was. They thought it had no significance. I'd have to say that this little book that I put out was something that only a mother could love, and then there'd be a kind of maybe a little bit of distance on the part of the mother. It was dry as dust, except for one thing. Because of a quirk in the North Korean statistics, we were able to estimate what the North Korean government thought the size of its armed forces were. They had reported total population up to about 1970, and after that, only civilian population. So you did not have to be a terribly clever demographer to continue the trend for total population, subtract civilian, and guess what you were left with, right? The numbers that we came up with were surprisingly very close to what US and ROK intelligence sources were publicly stating. They suggested an enormous military buildup between the mid-1970s and the late 1980s. I gave a copy of this draft report to our government, to the South Korean government, and to the North Korean government. And after a while, I got a phone call from New York, from the DPRK mission there, from the deputy ambassador who had arranged for my visit to Pyongyang in the first place. And we had a very charming phone call, and I don't remember everything that we said, but the final part of the phone call was really, was hard to forget. He said, "Mr. Eberstadt, you must understand your problem. You must think clearly about your problem, about my problem. You must not publish this book. We know where you live. We know about your wife. We know about your children. You must not publish this book." And I said something to the effect of, when you're a more open society, you won't be quite as flipped out by, information from the outside world, analysts from the outside world, and he, hung up very angry. I don't get out much, I admit, and I am not James Bond, but that sounded a tiny bit like a death threat to me. So nothing happened. I'm here to tell you the story. About a year later, the same ambassador called me up because he needed a favor. And he began his chat with me by saying, "Oh, Mr. Eberstadt, how is your lovely wife? How are your golden children?" And the point there just being, look, pal, I'm a diplomat for the DPRK. I'll threaten your kids with death. I'll flatter you. I'm just doing my job. So anyhow, that's the way it is.
Thank you very much for sharing, Nick. Going back to the Human Rights Act in Korea and here, Ethan, you have authored, drafted, circulated numerous petitions sent to presidents, government officials, UN agencies, UN officials. Many of these petitions have been within the spirit of the Human Rights Act here and in South Korea. We have been very happy to co-sign with you many of these petitions. Could you please give us an update on the petitions that you have already circulated and what you might have in the pipeline?
So most of these petitions, we started to send them out from last year. Actually, we sent out one around the last weeks of the Moon presidency, because that's when the Human Rights Council was adopting the North Korean Human Rights Resolution, as they do every year, and we were hoping that by this time Moon had already Lee Jae-myung had already lost the election to Yoon Suk-yeol, so everyone knew that Yoon would be president in like a month's time, and we were hoping that at least as one of his last official acts that Moon would reconsider, but didn't happen. But I think it was worth a try. And after the President Yoon took over in May last year, which is about a year ago, actually. So we wanted to actually encourage the new administration to try to normalize, basically, to fully implement the North Korean Human Rights Act. As I mentioned, the North Korean Human Rights Foundation was going nowhere because of the continuous opposition from the National Assembly. But we saw more rooms for possibilities on the accountability front. And so we were basically asking the government to reconsider the existing arrangement where the MOU took the lead and the MOJ had a very limited function in terms of kind of preparing for judicial accountability. And our asks were to basically during the Moon Jae-in period, initially in 2016, the MOJ archive was created with 4 public prosecutors to basically oversee the kind of analysis of the information provided from the MOU side to prepare the case files. And it was housed in the main Ministry of Justice building, which is in the Gwacheon government complex in Korea. And one of the things that Moon Jae-in did, the Moon government did, was they kicked out the office to a place called Yongin, which is far in the outskirts of Seoul. And they also took those 4 prosecutors away from the archive. So now the archive is left with 0 prosecutors. And we thought that was very problematic, and we wanted to raise that issue to the South Korean government that these mistakes needs to be fixed. And unfortunately, that issue has yet to be corrected. And the problem, again, is that it's very bureaucratic, I think, because the Minister of Justice is not under this kind of national security portfolio. People don't really associate the MOJ with this kind of North Korean human rights accountability work. And I think that kind of like, that is a problem within the current government as well. Another letter that we sent to the new government was calling for the more efforts to include, for example, like the reference to the POWs and the abductees, the South Korean POWs and abductees in the summit statements with the U.S. and other countries that President Yoon were meeting with. And again, this was so this kind of started with the trilateral Phnom Penh declaration last November, I think, where there were references to not only the Japanese abductees, but also to the South Korean abductees and the more recent South Korean detainees. And since then, we kind of also wanted to include the POW issue as well. And last April, in April 26th summit statement, they finally, so the recommendation that we made in the letter was actually incorporated. And actually, they added the reference to the POW, abductees, and the detainees. So that was partially successful. And another important issue that we tried to promote was with respect to the anti-leafleting law, the notorious law from the previous government that basically criminalized sending of leaflets, USBs, and other materials for information access. So obviously that was created by an act of the National Assembly, and the current government doesn't have a working majority in the National Assembly, so it's very difficult to revise or repeal that law. But one thing that it can do is to basically repeal the interpretive guideline that the MOU, the Ministry of Unification, published at the time of the enactment of this new law, because the interpretive guideline actually stated that even though the actual law states that it's supposed to regulate the activities along the inter-Korean border region, a very narrow strip of land, basically, the interpretive guideline actually suggested that it actually covers the entirety of the South Korean territory. So again, we thought that was not only problematic in content, but it didn't really make sense legally because the interpretive guidelines shouldn't like go over what the actual law states. And again, so that was actually issued by the Minister of the Unification at the time. So under the new government, if they had the will, they could have done this change. But again, for reasons that are like beyond our understanding, that interpretive guideline has yet to be revised. So we are continuously asking them to revise or actually we actually wanted to we asked them to insert the a phrase in the interpretive guideline so that this law does not affect the legitimate exercise of the freedom of expression under the ICCPR, the Civil and Political Rights Covenant. So we're still hoping that the government will take these actions, but we haven't really heard much from them yet. And so that's like as one point that I didn't mention earlier when I was explaining the South Korean version of the law, the North Korean Human Rights Act, which is that our North Korean Human Rights Act actually does not have any provision about expanding information access to North Korea, because that was considered politically too controversial at the time. And I guess one agency that's important when it comes to this kind of activities is a very obscure body called the Korean Communication Commission. It's kind of like the FCC here, except that it has a very broad regulatory authority when it comes to giving permits so that broadcasters in South Korea can actually send a radio broadcast to North Korea. So currently the KCC is the majority is again like most of the commissioners are the holdovers from the Moon Jae-in period, but they will be gradually replaced by the new ones appointed by the current government. So we are hoping that the new majority will allow for greater broadcasting to North Korea in the future. And one last point, we also sent the petition right after the change of government for the speedy appointment of our North Korean human rights ambassador, with the position that has been also vacant since 2017, kind of coinciding with the absence after Ambassador King's departure. So, and fortunately, a couple months later, Professor Lee Shin-hwa was appointed to this ambassadorship. So I think with hopefully Julie Turner's confirmation and appointment soon, we will have this kind of I guess the people who can actually in position to do the North Korean human rights diplomacy from both the U.S. and South Korean sides. So we are looking forward to that.
Thank you, Ethan. We continue to eagerly await your questions. Please let me know. Roberta, and then Ambassador Joseph, and then Hyun-Sun. Roberta, please go ahead.
I had a few questions just about the North Korea Human Rights Act in the United States. Over the years, there are some amendments that are made. Are there any major issues that have been added or you think should be that weren't there in the original 2004? And secondly, I remember there was an expression of encouragement to bring in more North Koreans to this country. I believe the numbers are something like 230 of who have gotten refugee status over the last, since the act in 2004. There seems to be a gap between that expression of interest in bringing in more North Koreans to this country and what actually takes place. Not that, I mean, there's not a large number that seek to come, but it often sounds as if there are legal and other obstacles in the way that make it difficult for North Koreans to actually come here. And I wondered whether under the act or whether under any congressional monitoring, anything can be done to bridge that.
Mr. King, would you like to
Yeah, I'd be happy
start with
to
this one?
talk about that. You're always very good about coming up with the problems. The question about amendments and changes, over the years, there have been very few changes in the North Korean Human Rights Act that Congress has passed. The most change occurred in 2008 when the legislation was reauthorized the first time. And basically, the change, particularly with regard to the special envoy, is the requirement was specified in the legislation that was adopted in 2008. The special envoy was to be a full-time position, and it was to have the rank of ambassador. Up to that point, special envoys are fairly frequent. Ambassadorial rank is a lot more complicated to get. A special envoy can be appointed by the president, or I'm not sure whether the Secretary of State has the authority on his own to do that, but it's not a hard thing to do. Ambassadorial rank requires Senate confirmation, makes it more complicated, frequently will take more time, but it also has more status. I'm an honorable, if you can believe that, but I still carry the title of the honorable. But there are certain kinds of things that helps. At the time, there was concern that the previous special envoy was doing it part-time. He was practicing law and also on the side was doing trips to primarily South Korea and other places. And the feeling was this needed to be a full-time position. This needed to have full attention of some important person. And you needed to have someone that was in the State Department who had some ability and authority in the State Department to get things done. And so I think it was a wise decision. It was, I think, an important decision. Having ambassadorial rank does help. Just the way I have been treated when I've been at UN meetings in Geneva and in New York. If you're an ambassador, you're in this very elevated status. Now, I'm still the same guy, and I'm still with the same disadvantages that I had before, but people treat me a lot nicer. And it does make a difference, and it was useful. That's, to my recollection, the only major change that occurred in the legislation. There is an issue in terms of the number of North Korean refugees who've come to the United States. One of the things, excuse me for this diversion, but one of the things that I noticed in the hearing yesterday when Julie Turner talked about her goals as special envoy and response and questions, we don't talk about defectors. We talk about escapees. And it's an interesting change in the language. Defector has a negative connotation. This is somebody that turned against the regime and left. An escapee is somebody who escaped the horrors of, it's a very interesting kind of thing. It's a distinction that doesn't apply in Korean, but it's one that entertains at least some Americans. But the concern about North Korean refugees, defectors, escapees, was one of the major sources of impetus behind the U.S. Human Rights, North Korea Human Rights Act. There was a concern, and the forces that were primarily leading the effort on this were some of the religious groups in the United States who were concerned about the North Koreans who were leaving and what was happening to them and so forth. North Korea has a very strong Christian tradition. surprising as that may sound. Pyongyang is referred to as the Jerusalem of the East. During the era in the period before World War II, that area had a lot of Christian missionaries, many of them from the United States. And the high school that these students attended was in Pyongyang. If your parents were missionaries in China, you went to Pyongyang for high school. Billy Graham's wife was a graduate of the Christian high school in Pyongyang. There was considerable success in preaching to the North Koreans, and they were more successful in the North than they were in the South originally. Kim Il-sung, his mother, was a Presbyterian elder. The family had very strong connections to the Christian community that was preaching in those parts of Asia at the time. So there was a very strong sense, as legislation was being put together, that this was something that was important to the religious community in the United States. People who were the members of Congress who were most active in pushing for this legislation were people who had strong connections with the Christian community in the United States. And so the feeling was that a lot of these North Koreans who are leaving probably had Christian backgrounds. They must want to come to a place like the United States, and therefore we need to make it easier for them to get here. We need to encourage them to come to the United States so they can settle here. Unfortunately, the North Koreans didn't look at it that way. They spoke Korean. Very few North Koreans who left North Korea spoke English. South Korea provided excellent programs for assistance to the escapees that were able to get out. The United States initially had been treating North Koreans like anybody else. And the one thing that the North Korea Human Rights Act did is to say North Koreans, because of the conditions they were in, deserve special attention. And therefore, we've got to give them special focus. And that was one thing that did happen. The immigration naturalization people focused on North Koreans. There were very few of them who chose to come to the United States, but that was part of what was behind it. It was primarily an issue that South Korea is a lot easier to get into for North Koreans, a lot easier to adjust, a lot easier to find assistance, and there was a large, excuse me, a large North Korean community in South Korea where they could feel at home. As you mentioned, there are only a couple hundred that have come to the United States, and I think that's a significant change and a significant difference. In spite of the fact that we've made it easier for North Koreans than was the case earlier, the numbers have not increased that much. There are more North Korean refugees, North Korean escapees, who have settled in England than have settled in the United States.
Pastor Robert Joseph.
Roberta?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
And if you disagree with me, I'm sure you're right.
I don't know if I disagree. But there were questions about the extent to which American embassies made known to North Koreans in Southeast Asia whether they could come here. I mean, how it would be if they came here, and any encouragement. There was, I don't think language training was provided, and some of them would have to wait for about more than 2 years. And so that was something they wouldn't have to do to go to South Korea, even though some of them may have wanted to come here. So the waiting period and the absence of training or anything useful for them to do there changed some of their minds to then go on to South Korea. And then there were legal complications, as I understand it, because there's a Refugee Act here, but they would say these are not refugees. because refugee would have to be they were persecuted in South Korea before they came here. I mean, there were legal things raised that were so tedious and unnecessary. So it sounded to me, and I don't know, that there was a bit of obstruction, maybe not intended, but that was coming out of or rising out of legal requirements, the definition of a refugee, then whether these people were encouraged or whether anything could be applied to them like was done. I mean, there could be an argument made that North Koreans in South Korea are not firmly resettled, and then they could come here. They did that with Soviet Jews who went to Israel first and then managed to come here. The same flexibility was not applied in the case of the North Koreans. So, I mean, the act says one thing, but the actual implementation seemed to be full of obstacles. But I did not study it. I just recall this, and I just wondered whether anybody looks at that.
No, it's true. There were issues and problems. One of the things that I made a point of doing when I was special envoy is most of the refugees that are coming out of North Korea were going through Thailand. When I was there, beginning, I started in 2009, I guess, late 2009. The refugee flow had focused almost completely on Thailand because you couldn't get out through Mongolia. And the result was that refugees would go down, would cross into Thailand directly, go through Burma. I think that was the main route. I made a point of going to all of these places where refugees were coming out and meeting with immigration naturalization people to try to make sure that they understood the interest of the Congress and of the U.S. government in helping North Korean refugees if they chose to come to the United States. The one thing that I sensed is that they were very well aware of that, and they made real efforts to be helpful with regard to North Korean refugees. The difficulty is that we did not have a lot of Korean speakers. We relied on the South Koreans who were helpful in translating and in interpreting for us. They were careful. If someone expressed an interest in going to the United States, the South Koreans did not try to discourage them to do otherwise. But quite frankly, most of the American resettlement programs tend to be handled through private organizations and private groups. In South Korea, assistance for North Korean refugees is handled by the government. They have the Ministry of Unification, which deals with a lot of the problems that refugees have. They are given a lot more help and assistance. One example, there was one young woman that I met in Bangkok when on one of my trips there. She had recently arrived from North Korea. She came from a fairly well-connected family. She and her son had managed to escape. And she had made the request to go to the United States rather than to South Korea. And we had a long conversation about that in the detention facility in Bangkok. It got to be very difficult for refugees, including her, because the United States requires a longer process of vetting than the South Koreans required. South Korea was able to get refugees through in a matter of months. As you mentioned, the United States, I think we were able to do it in a year or more than a year. So you're in a situation where, as a refugee, you have to live in a refugee facility where you're under guard, and it takes a year to get through the process. It's not something that we could get around because this is legislation that is required and there are security issues that were of concern. The interesting thing about this very interesting young woman that I met is that I inquired about her when I came back to Bangkok several months later to find out what had happened to her. She decided she would rather go to South Korea and ended up going to South Korea instead of to the United States. So it is definitely a problem. Part of it is our legislation. Part of it is simply the South Koreans have been much more embracing of North Koreans than the Americans have. We have people here who have done an excellent job of helping Koreans. And there are some private NGOs that do excellent work here. But in South Korea, it's a much larger effort. And the other thing is that many of the people who leave, the refugees, are people who have friends who are already in South Korea. And there's a much stronger push in that direction. So I came to the conclusion that there were problems, some of which were our legislation and our requirements, but basically there was a lot more to it than that. And that's one of the things that Congress has noted in the reauthorizations of the North Korea Human Rights Act, is that the number of refugees coming to the US is lower than what they had expected and what had been hoped for. But again, as I say, it's not something that I think we can easily change. So.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Lee Hyun-sung next. Ambassador Joseph has declined. Yes.
Thank you for sharing anecdotes with us, and it's very interesting. Since Ambassador King mentioned about Russian airplane, I would like to share one story. In 2006, there's one Hong Kong businessman who offered 2 Airbus for free to Kim Jong-il. And my father arranged a meeting between him and the general director of North Korea's air travel transportation. But he came to the table, insists Russian airplane rather having 2 Airbus for free. And his main objection was he's worried too much about getting maintenance and repair parts from France. So eventually they couldn't get any of them. And then the deal was, gone. So I must say the North Koreans' love of Russian airplane is extraordinary. My first question is to Dr. Eberstadt. Since you are economist, and then there are some critics talks about sanction is contributing North Korea's humanitarian crisis. Do you agree with this statement? And my second question is to do any of panelists believe that the humanitarian assistance can solve the decade-long humanitarian crisis in North Korea?
There's a discussion that goes back many decades about sanctions and authoritarian dictatorships. And this goes back to the Cold War era and actually even before the Cold War era, before World War II. And there's an argument that continues to have resonance in some circles, that sanctions in an authoritarian state will only injure the victims who have no voice in the society. If you took that argument to its logical conclusion, I suppose you would only wish to apply sanctions to democracies, because democracies are the only states where the population has a voice that's seen through the government. It's a little problematic in its framing in that way, but in practical terms, the argument that sanctions injure the voiceless population in North Korea has a missing element. And the missing element is the North Korean decision makers who, under pressure, could always change arrangements or policies to protect the well-being of their population. before the latest thicket of sanctions commenced in 2016 internationally with the missile and nuclear dramas, North Korea had a hunger crisis, and this was in the 1990s. There was an American sanctions regimen in place then, but there wasn't a broad international sanctions regimen against the DPRK. The hundreds of thousands or millions of people who perished in that famine, we don't know the exact numbers because the North Korean government has been a little bit modest about sharing that information with the outside world. They did not perish because of sanctions. They perished because of the government's approach to maintaining power and their refusal to moderate their control. And I think we now know in retrospect that the government and the Kim family had all of the resources that would have been necessary to feed everyone, and deciding not to feed people was a matter of state that had to do with the class stratification enforcement of the Songbun arrangements in North Korea. You were very unlikely to go hungry if you were in a core class. You had all too good a chance of disappearing from the earth if you were in the hostile classes, and that's because the government was just as happy if you were dead. And so starvation was an instrument of state in that case. How to implement humanitarian assistance for a situation like this sort of this particular chapter of the problem from hell is a really difficult one. The way that you probably can't do it is by cutting a check and sending it to the Kim family and asking them pretty please to make sure that some of the crumbs go to the people who need them the most. I had suggested a modest proposal, and I choose that phrase carefully, some years ago to suggest that if there were to be humanitarian assistance, it should be an intrusive aid program, because it's only by being able to have independent assessment of the need and independent allocation of resources to those who need them that the actual spirit of humanitarian assistance is likely to be brought into force. Nobody has ever been so rude as to suggest this to the North Korean government, and I don't think that we'd know if the North Korean government would accept assistance under such an approach until we ask.
Thank you. We'll take two final questions, Grace Kung and Dr. Larry Diamond. Grace, please.
Yes, my question is for Ambassador King. What would be your top 3 pieces of advice for our soon-to-be Ambassador Julie Turner?
Dr. Diamond, shall we take your question as well?
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to continue on the sanctions theme. One logic of sanctions, Nick, can be you create a lot of pain for the society, and then the society will rise up and, in essence, overthrow or pressure the regime. That doesn't seem too likely in this case. Or this regime will be upset that, you know, a lot of people are suffering, that this is not a regime that has that record. But the other logic is you inflict pain on the regime and induce defections from the regime. And so we know that this is a regime that needs to selectively distribute benefits to that top rung of society in order to hold its kind of ruling, I don't know if coalition is the right word, but base together. And so to any of you really, to what extent has the sanctions regime had any success in disrupting Kim Jong-un's ability to acquire, I'll say it metaphorically, the cognac and other items that kind of lubricate the pain of the society? And what more could we do to combat what seems to have been fairly skillful sanctions evasion?
I think that's a Dr. Eberstadt question.
I'll start with that. I'm in trouble. I mean, Larry, those are very important points, and there are other points I'd add there. If we leave on the side for a moment the question of humanitarian human rights, there's the whole practical question of whether economic sanctions can reduce the killing power of a state that's very interested in generating killing power. My impression is that the broad sanctions since 2016 from the UNSC give a sort of a license for doing just that. And I mean, we get into the world of anecdotes and Agatha Christie, he said, she said, North Korea lore, but there have been certain reports that Kim Jong-un was bemoaning the sanctions and the impact these had had in his discussions with Chinese and so forth. I mean, that could be just a gambit. If it's true, it could be just a gambit for getting even more aid from PRC. But I guess we can do the counterfactual and think what would happen if we didn't have the sanctions in place. And the counterfactual would be that the march towards nuclear weapons and towards successful long-range missiles pointed right here at this little area that we're in right now would have proceeded much more rapidly.
Very much.
Can I make a comment?
Please, yes.
Yeah. One of the things that the sanctions have done is they've made it a lot more expensive for Kim Jong-un to enjoy his luxuries. I remember seeing a particularly interesting article in the New York Times about how long it took to get a Mercedes from Northern Europe to Pyongyang, and it had to go through, it took months and months, and it cost a goodly amount because you had to keep shipping the Mercedes to a different place. He got it, but it was probably 3 or 4 times what it would have cost under normal circumstances. And that maybe is putting pressure on the regime, not just on Mercedes, but on benefits and so forth for the others. It does raise questions about what does this do then in terms of people who don't have food and who don't have medical care and who are suffering because of that. And all it does is make the suffering and the problems even greater. If we were to stop sanctions, would it improve the situation? Probably not. So this is one of those very tough ones to deal with. Can I make a couple of comments?
Absolutely.
About the question you asked on advice to Julie Turner. Julie Turner probably doesn't need my advice. When I was there, I would consult with her on issues that came up. We were always in the same place. We always tended to agree. If you read her testimony that she gave during the Senate hearing, and it's available online, she's got the ideas down. The things that the special envoy needs to do, we need to make sure that we get information into North Korea. We need to come up with ways of getting information there. The quickest way of undermining that regime is for people to know what's really going on elsewhere. And that's something that she didn't say in quite as stark a terms as I would, but that's what she was pointing at. The same thing in terms of humanitarian assistance. How can we provide help for the North Koreans? We need to continue to press the North Koreans through the United Nations and through various other organizations. The North Koreans are a really disgusting country. And quite frankly, most of the other countries that are members of the United Nations recognize that. And what we need to do is make sure that we continue to press the North Koreans in the United Nations, in the Security Council. We need to have debates on North Korea in the Security Council. We need to continue what we do in the Human Rights Council. Every year, there's a discussion of what's going on in North Korea. We have excellent reports. The Commission of Inquiry came out of this. Those kinds of things are efforts that we need to continue to press. They're also the kind of thing that we need to work on in other areas as well, in addition to the United Nations. But all of these efforts, she knows where to go. She's got it down. It would be presumptuous of me to advise her on what to do. I would certainly cheer for her, though.
Thank you. Ethan, one quick final comment on sanctions.
Just to going back to the sanction issue, speaking of counterfactuals, so this is something that Citizens Alliance, Joanna at the Citizens Alliance had researched, and right before the Hanoi summit in early 2019, that's when there was this expectation within North Korea that somehow Kim Jong-un will cut a deal with Trump, and all the sanctions would be lifted in a matter of a short period of time. There were actually activities in the political prison camps and in also in the coal regions. Basically, they were expanding the facilities because in the expectation that once these sanctions are lifted, that they can export the coal and other resources produced from these areas with this kind of slave labor. So obviously, there's no easy way out, but I think when we talk about sanctions, we need to consider that dimension as well.
Ambassador King, Dr. Eberstadt, Dr. Shin, thank you very much. It's been a terrific panel. Thank you all for listening. Big round of applause.